The divorce papers were sitting on our kitchen table when I got home from work, and my husband was standing by the window with his arms crossed like he'd already decided everything. I remember setting my bag down slowly, the kind of slow you do when your brain hasn't caught up to what your eyes are seeing. We had a nice kitchen, quartz countertops my father had picked out himself, big windows that looked out over the ravine. He bought us that house as a wedding gift, 3 years earlier, on a quiet street in Oakville. I'd grown up watching him build things, my father. Restore things. He started with nothing. A young man from Cape Breton who drove to Toronto with a second-hand pickup truck and a contractor's license, and by the time I was born, he had turned that into Hargrove Property Group, one of the most respected mid-sized development firms in southern Ontario. I was his only daughter. He used to call me his North Star. I used to roll my eyes at that. I wish I hadn't. My husband's name was Douglas. We'd met at a fundraising gala my father hosted in 2019. Douglas was charming the way certain men are charming. Effortlessly, almost automatically. He knew which fork to use and when to laugh and how to make my father feel like the smartest man in the room. My father liked him. I liked him. I thought that was enough. We were married 11 months after that gala. My mother cried through the whole ceremony. My father danced with me to an old Gordon Lightfoot song, and he held my face in both of his hands afterward and said, "You come home if you ever need to. Promise me." I thought he was just being sentimental. I promised him anyway. 2 years in, things changed. Or maybe they didn't change. Maybe I just started paying attention. Douglas had taken a role managing the financial side of one of my father's condo projects in Hamilton, something my father had offered as a kind of gesture, a way to bring him into the family business. Douglas took to it quickly, maybe too quickly. He started working late. He started taking calls in the garage. He started looking at me differently, not unkindly, exactly, but assessingly. The way you look at something when you're deciding what it's worth. Then one winter, my father called me on a Tuesday afternoon and told me he was in trouble. "The business," he said. "There are some complications. I need to restructure. It could get worse before it gets better, sweetheart." He didn't say bankrupt. He didn't use that word, but I heard it anyway underneath everything else he said. I hung up the phone and sat on the floor of my bathroom for 20 minutes. I told Douglas that night. He was quiet for a long time. Then he nodded slowly and said, "I figured something was coming. Don't worry, we'll be okay." I thought he was reassuring me. I was wrong about that too. 3 weeks later, Douglas came home with a folder. He set it on the kitchen table the same way he'd later set the divorce papers, deliberately, like placing a chess piece. He said it was a legal restructuring document, something his lawyer had drawn up to protect our assets in case my father's situation affected us indirectly. He explained it quickly using language I half understood, standing the whole time instead of sitting down with me. He said our financial advisor had looked it over. He said it was standard. He said he needed my signature that evening because of a filing deadline. I should have called someone. I should have called my father, or a lawyer, or even just slept on it. But Douglas was looking at me with that patient expression he had, the one that made me feel like asking questions was the same as saying I didn't trust him, and I was tired and I believed him, and so I signed. I didn't read it carefully. That is the thing I have to live with. The document was a transfer of interest. What I had signed in our home, witnessed only by Douglas and his mother, who had, I noticed afterward, been sitting quietly in the living room that whole time, which I hadn't thought was strange until I thought about it later, was a quick claim transferring my share of the Oakville house entirely into Douglas's name. I didn't know that for 6 more months. Those 6 months were the strangest of my life. Douglas became warmer, almost, more attentive. He started suggesting we travel. He talked about fresh starts. I thought we were in a good patch. I was grateful for it. I told my mother things were better. She said she was glad. Then in March, He asked me to sit down and he told me he wanted a divorce. He was calm about it, almost kind. He said we'd grown apart. He said he thought we both knew it. He slid the papers across the table with one finger, the way you'd push a card across a counter, and he said his lawyer had made everything as straightforward as possible. I looked at the papers for a long time. Then I said I wasn't leaving. He blinked. I'm sorry? I'm not leaving, I said. This is my home. My father bought this house. He sat back. Something shifted in his face then, the careful warmth gone, replaced by something older and harder underneath. He said I was being emotional. He said the situation was settled. He said I needed to take some time, think clearly, and then start making arrangements. I didn't move from the kitchen table. By the following morning, his mother had arrived with 2 suitcases and set herself up in the guest room at the end of the hall. I want to be clear about this. She was living in my house. The house my father had bought for me. The house I had signed away without reading, in her presence, while she sat quietly and said nothing. And now she was unpacking her things into the closet down the hall from where I slept. I kept making coffee in the mornings. I kept going to work. I didn't say anything yet because I was waiting. I had called a lawyer, a real one. One I found myself, whose number I got from a woman at my office who'd gone through her own divorce 2 years before. My lawyer's name was Helena, and she was exactly the kind of woman you want in your corner when things are bad. Quiet, precise. The sort of person who reads the fine print twice before she reads it again. Tell me everything, she said at our first meeting. So I did. She asked me for the date on the document I had signed. I told her. She wrote it down and circled it. Then she said, "And you signed this in your home? Only your husband and his mother present?" "Yes." She nodded slowly. In Ontario, a quitclaim deed is not valid unless it's signed in the presence of a licensed notary or commissioner of oaths who can verify the identity of the person signing. A family member witnessing does not meet that standard. And looking at the date, she turned her notepad toward me. This was signed 11 days before he served you with divorce papers. I stared at her. Which means, she continued, that this transfer was almost certainly planned in advance of informing you of his intentions. We can challenge this. I would argue we have a strong case. I drove home from Helena's office with the windows down even though it was only April and still cold. I needed the air. When I walked in, Douglas was on the phone in the kitchen. His mother was watching television in the living room. She glanced up at me and then looked back at the screen. That was when Douglas, apparently not hearing me come in, said into the phone, "She's dragging her feet. I don't know, maybe another week. I'll call her father if I have to. He can come get his dead weight." I stood very still in the hallway. He turned around and saw me. The phone went quiet. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and went upstairs. That night I called my father. Not to cry, not to ask him to fix it. I'd done that once in my life when I was 19 and a boy I'd been seeing cheated on me at a ski trip in Blue Mountain. And my father had driven 2 hours in the snow to bring me home. And I had decided that night that I never wanted to need rescuing again. So I called him not for rescue, but to tell him the truth. All of it. The document I'd signed without reading. The date. The witness. What Helena had told me. What I'd heard Douglas say on the phone. There was a long silence. Then my father said, "Sweetheart, I need to tell you something." He was not bankrupt. He had never been bankrupt. What he had done, and he said this carefully, slowly in the voice he used when he was choosing every word, was restructure deliberately. He had moved assets into a family trust 18 months prior on the advice of his estate lawyer as part of his long-term succession planning. The complications he'd mentioned were real but manageable. He had not collapsed. He had reconfigured. I told Douglas in early January, he said, in a meeting. I explained the trust structure to him directly because he was managing the Hamilton project and he needed to understand the liability boundaries. I sat on the edge of my bed. He knew, I said. He knew, my father said. Douglas had known the business wasn't failing. He'd told me a version of events that was just real enough to be believable, just frightening enough to make me want to protect what we had. And then he put a piece of paper in front of me and told me to sign it quickly. In the presence of his mother, at night when I was tired and scared. I need you to do something for me, I said to my father. Not for me. With me. There's a difference. He understood what I meant. He didn't argue. The next morning, I emailed Helena and told her we were ready to move. She filed with the Ontario Superior Court of Justice that afternoon, citing the procedural invalidity of the transfer. No licensed commissioner, irregular timing, and the circumstances indicating undue influence. She also filed an emergency motion to prevent any further dealings with the Oakville property until the matter was resolved. 3 days later, Helena called to tell me the transfer had been set aside pending the full hearing. The house was, legally, back in joint title. I didn't say anything to Douglas that evening. I made dinner. His mother said the pasta was overcooked. I agreed with her pleasantly. The following morning, a courier arrived at the door while Douglas was still upstairs. I signed for the envelope and set it on the kitchen counter. It was addressed to him, from Helena's office, a formal notice of the court's interim order. Douglas came downstairs in his housecoat. He saw the envelope. He looked at me. You should read that, I said. I poured my coffee and sat down at the table. I watched his face as he opened it. The careful composure he always had, that smooth, managed expression, it just left him. All at once. Like something unplugging. You can't do this, he said. Helena says I can, I said, and she's usually right about these things. He called his own lawyer immediately, standing in the kitchen, not even going into the garage. I think he'd forgotten to be strategic about it. His mother came downstairs in her housecoat and Douglas said something to her in a low voice and she looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. That afternoon, my father arrived. He didn't come alone. He came with his estate lawyer, a woman named Roberta who had worked with our family for 12 years and who carried a leather folder and said very little. They sat at my kitchen table, the table with the quartz countertops in the house on the ravine, and my father looked at Douglas for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, I think we should talk about the Hamilton project. I don't know exactly what was said in the meeting that followed, because I went for a walk. I walked along the ravine trail behind the house for 45 minutes, and when I came back, the cars were still in the driveway and the house was very quiet. Helena had explained to me that under Ontario family property law, the house, even if the transfer had been valid, which it wasn't, would have been subject to equalization proceedings as matrimonial property, and given the circumstances under which I signed, the court was unlikely to view the transfer favorably regardless. Douglas's position was not as solid as he believed. It had never been. That evening, Douglas told me he would be staying at a hotel. He said it without looking at me directly. His mother packed her suitcases again, and they left together in his car just after 7 o'clock. I stood at the front window and watched the headlights back out of the driveway and turn down the street. Then I called my best friend, Amara, and told her everything, and she drove over with red wine and leftover Thai food, and we sat on my kitchen floor for 3 hours, and I cried exactly once. Just once. A short, ugly cry. And then I felt better. The divorce was finalized 4 months later. Helena was thorough, and so was the court. The house remained mine. Douglas's attempt to remove assets via the quitclaim was included in the record of proceedings, which meant his position in the equalization calculation was substantially weakened. My father's trust structure was never at risk. Roberta had made sure of that long before any of this happened. The Hamilton project was quietly transitioned to a different manager. There is something I want to say, not as a conclusion exactly, but just as something true. For a long time after all of it, I kept coming back to the moment in the hallway, hearing my own husband call me dead weight on the phone, in my own house, to someone I didn't know, like I was a problem to be dealt with. It took me a while to stop flinching at that memory. It took me a while to understand that what he had counted on, the whole way through, was that I wouldn't read carefully, wouldn't ask questions, would sign where I was told, and trust where I shouldn't. What changed things was not my father coming in like a rescue. What changed things was me calling Helena first. Me sitting at that table and not moving. Me making the choice not to leave before I understood what I was leaving. My father did tell me something the night I called him. At the end of the call, after everything practical had been said, he got quiet the way he does sometimes, and then he said, "You know, your grandfather used to say, the only contracts worth signing are the ones you've read twice and slept on once." I laughed a little. It was the first time I'd laughed in days. "I know, Dad," I said. "I know that now. I'm back in architecture now." I put my own work on hold during the marriage, quietly, gradually, the way you put things down without noticing the weight until they're gone. I have a small studio in Hamilton, ironically. I walk to work most mornings. The Ravine house sold in the fall, and I bought a condo on James Street North with the proceeds, and I furnished it with things I chose myself, and there is not a single quartz countertop in it. My father visited last month. We had dinner at a restaurant on Lock Street, and he ordered the halibut and talked about a new project in Waterloo, and afterward we walked along the waterfront in the early dark, and he put his arm around my shoulders the way he used to when I was small, and neither of us said anything for a while. That was enough. I've thought a lot about that moment in the hallway, hearing my own husband say those words into his phone, not knowing I was standing 5 feet away, and feeling the floor sort of tilt under me. Not because it was a surprise, exactly. Looking back, nothing about Douglas was really a surprise. It was more that hearing it out loud made something click into place. All the small things I'd explained away, the late calls, the careful language, the way he stood instead of sitting when he needed something from me, it all landed at once. What I keep coming back to is not the betrayal itself, but how much I had participated in my own vulnerability. I don't say that to be hard on myself. I say it because it's true and because I think it matters. I signed a document I didn't read. I accepted an explanation because questioning it felt disloyal. I confused trust with passivity, and I paid for that confusion in a way that took months and a very good lawyer to untangle. Douglas was counting on that. He had read me correctly, or he thought he had. He believed that if he moved quickly enough, used the right tone, kept things just complicated enough that I wouldn't want to slow things down, I would sign and defer and eventually leave quietly. And for a while, he wasn't wrong. The version of me who signed that quitclaim was someone who had gotten very good at not making things difficult, at smoothing things over, at being agreeable. What changed wasn't my father arriving. What changed was me deciding alone in that kitchen that I wasn't going to move until I understood what I was moving away from. That decision, small as it looked from the outside, was the thing that made everything else possible. Helena, the court filing, the interim order, none of it happens if I walk out the door that first night. There's something about integrity that people don't talk about enough, which is that it includes being honest with yourself about what you don't know. I hadn't read the document. That was a failure of diligence, not character, but it was still mine to own. And owning it, clearly without making excuses, was what let me move forward without bitterness. I wasn't a victim of Douglas's scheme so much as someone who had made a correctable mistake and then corrected it. The strength it took to sit at that table and not leave, I didn't know I had it. I think a lot of people don't know what they're capable of until the moment asks it of them. My grandfather, apparently, used to say you should read a contract twice and sleep on it once. I learned that lesson the hard way. But I learned it. And the learning cost me something. But it gave me back something more valuable, which was a clear sense of what I would and wouldn't accept going forward. My studio on James Street North has a big east-facing window, In the mornings, the light comes in flat and clean, and I make my coffee and I read everything before I sign it. That's enough. That's more than enough.